Trade and commerce. The earliest medieval merchants were peddlers who sold goods to villages and towns. By the 12th century, Europe had grown more prosperous and more goods were produced. Merchants were no longer simply wandering adventurers. They became dealers, employers, and ship owners, sending their carriers along a network of trade routes linking the European cities. By 1300, cargo ships from Genoa and Venice were taking precious metals, silks, and other luxuries from the eastern Mediterranean out to England and Flanders or Belgium. There they picked up wool, coal, and timber for the return voyage. German and Dutch ships took iron, copper, and lead south to the Mediterranean and brought back wine, oil, and salt. Candle wax. This tiny candle was used to melt the wax for sealing letters and documents. Balancing the books. Merchants needed to keep careful accounts of their money. Traders in 14th century Florence developed a system of double-entry bookkeeping. Each deal was recorded in two ledgers, one for credits, the other for debits. The amounts in each ledger should always balance. Horn, inkwell, and quill. Quills were trimmed before use. 1/2 of a tally stick. Tally stick. A debt could be recorded on a tally stick. Notches were cut into it to record the amount. Then the stick was split in two and each party kept half. When the debt was settled, the tally was destroyed or kept as a record. Keep the change. Merchants kept small numbers of coins in money boxes like this. Most coins were silver, but in 1252 the city of Florence minted the first gold coin since Roman times, the golden florin. 14th century document seal. Signed and sealed. As trading methods grew more complex, much more paperwork was needed. Merchants had to employ clerks and scribes to help them. There were letters giving details of business deals, bills of sale, orders, contracts to suppliers, and documents promising payment. All of these had to be signed and marked with the wax seals of the merchants involved. Late medieval purse frame. A wooden calculator. For most of the Middle Ages, paper was scarce and few people could read or write, so traders added up their cash on a counter board marked in columns. Jetons, or counters, were added to a column until they reached a certain total, usually 10. Then they were removed and counting began in the next column. The Hanseatic League. In the 13th century, trading towns on the North Sea and Baltic coasts included Hamburg above, united to form the Hanseatic League. Their aim was to help each other in fighting pirates and bandits and to gain exclusive control of foreign trade. The league grew very powerful. By 1400, it had offices in 160 towns in northern Europe. Silver, deniers, and purse. Weighting it up. Most medieval merchants carried small coin balances for weighing different currencies to determine their value. Tumbrel coin balance. Spike sticks into desktop. 14th century keys for locking away valuables. Moneymen. Banking began in Italy with moneylenders who did business on benches or banks. They grew rich on the interest they charged for their services. The cities of Florence, Venice, Siena, and Genoa became particularly prosperous. However, the business was not without its hazards. Two wealthy banks in Florence were ruined in the 1350s when Edward III of England, 1327 through 77, was unable to repay a massive loan. Life in the town. As trade grew, so did towns. At first they were part of a lord's or king's domain, but as townsmen became wealthier, they resented having to work for someone else. In northern France, there were violent scenes as towns struggled to become independent communes. In England, the process was more peaceful. Town dwellers agreed to pay a fixed sum each year in return for a royal charter which granted them the right to govern themselves. The town then became a free borough with the power to make its own laws, form trade guilds, page 50, and raise taxes. The people also became burgesses or free citizens. The night watch. At sunset, the town bells rang to sound the curfew. This meant that everyone had to finish work and go home. There were no streetlights in medieval towns, and the streets could be dangerous places after dark. Night watchmen patrolled with lanterns to deter criminals. Street signs. Towns were first and foremost centers of trade with bustling streets full of shops. Since few people could read, many shops advertised their wares by hanging out a symbol of their trade, such as a loaf for a baker or a basin for a barber, seen in the middle of the picture. In some towns, traders or craftsmen of the same type had shops in the same street, so shoemakers worked in Shoe Lane, tailors in Threadneedle Street, fishmongers in the Rue de la Poissonnerie, and so on. 15th century French city. Walled in. Medieval towns were surrounded by stone walls. These were not only to keep out rogues and criminals, they also made sure that merchants and other visitors could enter only by the gates, where they had to pay a toll. Town gates were opened at dawn and locked at dusk. The Lord Mayor. Most towns were governed by an elected mayor and a local council. Mayors became powerful figures who were often courted by lords and kings. Some even loaned money to the monarch. Dick Whittington, circa 1358 to 1423, was a famous English mayor. The son of a knight, he became a wealthy merchant and was elected Lord Mayor of London 3 times. Towers that be. Powerful families struggled to gain control of the new communes and boroughs. In Italy, they built defensive towers as symbols of their wealth and importance. At San Gimignano in Tuscany, over 70 towers were erected in the 12th century. Eventually, most town councils forbade any building higher than the town hall. Gardez-Lou. Slop pails and chamber pots were emptied out of windows with the cry, Gardez-Lou, from the French Gardez-Leu, meaning look out water. Town dwellers were naturally wary when walking down the street. Half-moon leather knife. Spike possibly used to make holes for stitching. Upper stories were home to the shopkeeper's family. A staircase at the rear leads to the upper chambers. Living over the shop. Most craftsmen had their workshops on the ground floors of their homes. These also served as shops, and finished goods were displayed on a hinged shelf at the front. In the evening, shutters were pulled down for security. The shopkeeper usually had a storeroom at the back, and he and his family lived on the floors above. This 15th century building is divided into 2 shops. Only the smaller shop on the right has access to the upper floors, which means that the other was probably rented out to another business. Hook-like leather knife. Sole made from tough cattle hide. Wax linen thread. Upper made from goat skin, which is strong and flexible. Half-finished shoe will be turned other way out when complete. Lean streets. There was a limited amount of space within the walls of a medieval town, and houses were built very close together. To maximize space, the upper stories of buildings were jettied or built jutting out above the ground floors. In some places, the houses on either side almost touched each other, making the streets gloomy and airless. Town trade. Craftsmen such as shoemakers worked at windows that opened onto the street, giving them the opportunity to show off their skills to passers-by. Medieval shoemakers were known as cordwainers, after the best shoe leather from Cordoba in Spain. These long-toed Praulane shoes were fashionable in the late 14th century and would have been sold to a wealthy merchant or burgess. The Guild Masters. In 1262, a book of trades compiled in Paris listed over 100 different crafts, each of which had its own guild or association. By the 1420s, guilds existed in most big towns throughout Europe, and their numbers were still growing. A guild's main objective was to gain high wages and exclusive control of their business for their members. They fixed prices and standards of work and made sure that no outsiders competed with them. Guilds also supported members who fell in hard times, providing them with money from a central fund. In time, the guilds grew rich and powerful. They built grand guild halls, paraded in fine costume on special occasions, and often played an important role in civic affairs. Emblem of the Armorers' Guild. The Armorers. The Armorers' Guild maintained the standards of the craftsmen who made plate armor. Near Milan in Italy, one of the centers of armor making in the 15th century, whole villages were employed in the trade. Mail coif. Coiled wire. Flap protects the mouth. Each ring end is flattened and linked by a rivet. Rivets. Flap protects the mouth. Another fine mesh. Mail making was a skilled and painstaking process. Each ring was linked to 4 others and held together by a tiny rivet. An entire suit of mail could be made up of thousands of rings. Pliers. Women at work. Most guilds would not allow women members, but this did not prevent women from learning skilled trades. Many worked with their husbands or fathers. Silk weaving in London was almost entirely done by women, although they were not allowed to form their own guild. Green comes from woad leaves and weld. Blue produced by woad or indigo dyes. Linen dyed with madder root. Bright orange and red dyes come from madder roots. Oak bark gives a brown color. Plant dyed wools. Yellow comes from dyers' green weed or weld. Emblem of the Ropemakers' Guild. Master dyers. In the Middle Ages, cloth making was a gigantic industry that employed a large array of guild crafts. There were the weavers, the fullers and walkers who cleaned and compacted the cloth, the carders who brushed it, and the shearmen who trimmed it. Then there were the dyers who dyed the cloth in huge heated vats full of dye. Guild halls. The richer guilds had chambers or guild halls which proudly displayed their coats of arms. Here members met for a banquet on the anniversary of their patron saint, and the guild court sat to settle disputes and punish members who had disobeyed the strict rules. Borellis, hats derived from a hood worn the wrong way around. Emblem of the Bakers' Guild. The Guildmaster. This fine costume would have been worn by a middle-class merchant or business owner in the 1400s. Toward the end of the Middle Ages, the wealthier merchants began to control the guild's affairs for their own ends. They bought the raw materials and sold the finished goods and were more interested in making money than in the welfare of the poorer tradesmen. Guildmasters also became important civic figures who often had the final say in the election of the town mayor. Fashionable fur-trimmed sleeves. Decorated leather purse. Personal eating knife. Blue woolen doublet lined with linen. Learning a trade. Getting to the top of a guild was a long and hard process. An apprentice had to pay a large sum of money just to start. His apprenticeship lasted for about 7 years, during which he learned every aspect of the craft from a master, here seen judging work by a mason and a carpenter. After this he became a journeyman, from the French journey or day, and worked for a daily wage. A journeyman could one day become a master as long as he paid the right fees. The codpiece which served as a fly became fashionable after 1450. Fine woolen coat made with a large amount of material as a sign of wealth. Expensive mid-calf leather boots. Joined hose were made to measure. Emblem of the Shoemakers' Guild. The stonemasons. Of all medieval craftsmen, skilled masons were the most highly paid and respected. It was they who built the great cathedrals and castles that still rise above many European towns and cities. Before they formed exclusive guilds, page 50 to 51, in the 14th century, masons organized their trade from their lodges. These were the masons' headquarters on the building site, where they worked in bad weather, ate their meals, and discussed trade secrets. Rules and working conditions were set out by the lodge leaders. Masons learned their craft on the site itself, often serving an apprenticeship of up to 7 years. The most talented might go on to become master masons, with the responsibility for designing and overseeing the building of an entire cathedral. Sinking square. Each stone had to be worked precisely to shape before being hoisted into position. The sinking square was used to measure the depth of holes or grooves and to check that the corners were square. Stock rests on the top of the stone. Blade measures depth. Pitching tool for making clean breaks in rough stone. Well-worn chisel head. Squared up. The square was one of the mason's most important tools. It was used for making sure corners were straight. Scoring a curve. The mason had to mark out his stone to show him where to cut or carve. To mark a curved line parallel to the edge, he used a box trammel. Holding the wooden handle firmly against the edge, he dragged it along. The trammel point moved across the stone, scoring a line. Picture this. Every single stone in a cathedral would have taken about a day to cut and finish. Because it was heavy and expensive to transport, the stone was cut approximately to size at the quarry. At the building site, the mason's first job was to finish cutting the rough stone with a big curved saw. Then he used a hammer, a heavy blunt chisel called a pitching tool, and a punch to chip off the larger lumps and produce nearly straight edges. Hammer-headed chisels. Punch for chipping off large bits of stone. United by dividers. Dividers or wing compasses became the mason's special emblem. They were used mainly to measure a distance on a template and then transfer the measurement to a piece of stone. Heavy lump. The lump hammer was used for hitting hammer-headed chisels in the rough shaping work. Medieval dividers. Temple for the cross-section of the joint. Joint. Paper template for a piece of window tracery. According to plan. The template or pattern for each stone was cut out of board, leather, or parchment and laid over the stone for the mason to copy. Marking out. The mason selected a block of stone that had been trimmed squared and smooth on which to mark out the template. He then scribed or scratched around the edges. Choosing a chisel. An apprentice mason had to learn to handle a bewildering array of chisels. Each mason owned his own tools, all of which bore his personal mark. They were usually passed down from generation to generation. The design of modern masonry tools like these has changed little since medieval times. Drafting chisel for carving the first outline. Gouge for working curved surfaces. Malt-headed chisels for use with a mallet. Claw chisel for scraping away stone. Works of art. Some stonemasons became specialist sculptors. Intricate carvings such as the figures, foliage, and animals that decorated the great cathedrals were created by highly skilled imaginators. Stone relief left dedicated to the Stonemasons Guild from the Church of Or San Michael in Florence. Mastermind. The master mason was in charge of everything on the building site, from designing the building to hiring workers and ordering stone from the quarry. His job was that of an architect and a foreman all rolled into one. He set out plans and templates for his workers, but was also expected to work alongside them on occasion. Cusp, from the Latin cuspis, which means spearhead. Shaping the stone. The final shaping of the stone was the job of a banker mason who worked on a banker bench. Using chisels, gouges, and saws, he cut the stone to the scribed pattern. The finished article. The carving of ornamental stonework, such as the stone ribs or tracery that supported stained glass windows, took many years to master. Experienced stonemasons could carve any number of complex pieces. The section of tracery links the delicate ribs in the upper part of a window. Masons rub away tool marks on soft stone with a toothed iron plate called a coxcomb or drag. Mason's mark. A mason signed each finished stone with his personal mark to show how much work he had completed. Working in the lodge. Outside building work was only done in the good weather of the summer months. In winter, stonemasons labored on under cover in their lodge, designing, marking out, and cutting pieces of stone. Death and disease. Death was ever present for people living in the Middle Ages. Disease was rife in the dirty, overcrowded streets of medieval towns and cities, and medical knowledge was limited. The average life expectancy was about 30 years. Frequent wars and famines claimed thousands of lives at a time. The most catastrophic event of all was the Black Death. Carried by black rats, it was brought back from Asia by Italian sailors. The plague was deadly and highly contagious. Symptoms included black and blue blotches on the body. No cure was ever found. It swept through Europe between 1347 and 1350. By the end of 1348, at least a third of the entire population of Europe had died. Feverfew. Strong-smelling feverfew was used to treat headaches and to assist in childbirth. Lungwort. Because the shape of its leaves resembled lungs, lungwort was used to treat chest disorders. Marjoram. Marjoram was used to make healing poultices to place on bruises and swelling. Lemon balm. This plant was seen as a kind of magic elixir that could cure serious illnesses. It was also used for fevers and colds because it causes sweating. Herbal medicine. Medieval medicine was based mainly on folklore and superstition rather than scientific observation. For example, many medical handbooks recommended that healing herbs should be picked on magical days of the year, such as Midsummer's Eve. However, many of the herbs used in medieval times are still employed by herbalists today. Priest anoints a dying man with holy oil. Doctor's surgery. The most common form of surgery was bloodletting above, which was carried out by uneducated barber surgeons. People believed it restored the balance of the body's fluids, but more often it seriously weakened sick patients. Last rites. People in the Middle Ages believed it was important to die properly. They thought that if they did not make a final confession of their sins to a priest, they would go to hell. Page 31. But as the Black Death raged, so many priests perished that most of the people who died were buried without prayers or ceremony. Preparations were often stored in sheep's horns. Wormwood. Wormwood was used to rid the digestive system of worms and was also placed in clothes to repel fleas. At the dentist. Without modern painkillers, most medieval surgical treatments must have been fairly unpleasant. Rotten teeth were yanked out by tooth pullers who worked at weekly markets. Whelk shell. Tooth powder was fairly abrasive. Linen bung for powder container. Oyster shell. Cuttlefish. Medieval toothpaste. Ingredients like these were ground up to make powder for cleaning teeth. Such preparations would have been used by wealthy people mainly for cosmetic purposes, since there was no knowledge of the need for dental hygiene. Breath was sweetened with honey and coriander or cumin seeds. Plague pits. At the height of the Black Death, people had to carry their own dead to mass burial pits because there were not enough coffins to go round. In Paris, nearly 800 people died every day. Simple lead crosses such as these were placed on the corpses. Skeleton dances to a pipe and tabor. Page 57. The Dance of Death. The theme of death as the great leveler was acted out in the macabre dance of death. Men dressed as skeletons dance with figures representing each level of society to show that death comes to all. The dance of death was also depicted in many churches' carvings, paintings, and manuscripts. Fearful monk is dragged off by the deathly dancer. Fear of the plague. This is the end of the world, lamented an Italian chronicler of the Black Death. Many believed the plague was divine punishment for human sins, and the church held special services and processions. Who's who? The feudal territories of medieval Europe were totally dominated by those who held land, power, and money, the kings, emperors, and nobles. A smaller group of people, rebels and revolutionaries, dedicated their lives to changing the status quo. Observing and recording the times they lived in, artists, writers, and scientists produced work that helped spread knowledge, enrich spirits, and enhance our modern historical understanding. Richard the Lionheart. Power and nobility. Charlemagne. Charlemagne 742 to 814. King of the Franks, early inhabitants of France. Charlemagne united much of modern France and Germany. A great leader and lawmaker and a champion of arts and letters as well as a legendary warrior, he was crowned First Holy Roman Emperor by Pope Leo III. Alfred the Great, circa 846 to 899. Initially King of Wessex, Alfred made peace with the Viking leader Guthrum under the Treaty of Wedmore and assumed control of all England. As ruler, he reformed Saxon law, promoted education, and commissioned the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a history of the English people. King Canute, circa 994 to 1035. When the Viking Sven Forkbeard died in 1014, his son Canute inherited his Danish crown but was challenged to his father's English throne. After 2 years of conflict, however, Canute triumphed, becoming the respected king of an empire that was soon to include Norway and southern Sweden as well as Denmark and England. William of Normandy, circa 1027 to 1087. Aggrieved that the English throne went to Harold, Earl of Wessex, when it had been pledged to him by Edward the Confessor, William invaded England in 1066 and defeated Harold at the Battle of Hastings. As king, William brought stability and introduced the feudal system. Frederick I Barbarossa, circa 1121 to 1190. Holy Roman Emperor from 1152, Frederick I, his nickname means Red Beard, unified the German states. He drowned crossing a river on his way to the Third Crusade. Henry II, 1133 to 1189. Only 21 when he became English king, Henry Plantagenet was involved in reforming the church. Lord of an empire that included much of France, he also laid the foundation for common law, including the right to trial by jury. See also St. Thomas Becket. Saladin, 1137 to 1193. Egyptian sultan who recaptured Jerusalem from the Crusaders. Defeated elsewhere by Richard I, he agreed the right of Christians to undertake pilgrimages to the Holy City. Richard I, 1157 to 1199. Known as the Lionheart, Richard ruled for 10 years, most of which he spent at war in France and on the Third Crusade. One of England's most celebrated kings, he passed just 7 months of his reign at home. Philip II, 1165 to 1223. Ruler of France from 1180, Philip, also known as Philip Augustus, fought 3 English kings, Henry II, Richard I, and John, to gain control of their French territories, a goal he finally accomplished in 1214. King John, 1166 to 1216. Younger brother of Richard I, John is remembered mainly for signing the Magna Carta, or Great Charter. Its limiting of royal power was a milestone in English constitutional history. Frederick II, 1194 to 1250. Holy Roman Emperor from 1212, Frederick led the Sixth Crusade, returning Jerusalem temporarily to Christian rule. A religious skeptic, he was considered the most cultured man of his time. Louis IV, 1214 to 1270. Outstandingly moral and brave king of France, Louis was revered across Europe and fought in 2 crusades. He died of the plague on his way to lead the Eighth Crusade, and he was later canonized. Henry VI, 1293 to 1350. Philip was the first French king of the House of Valois, which was based in the province of Burgundy. Inherited in 1328, his crown was challenged by Edward III of England, who defeated him in a battle of Crécy in 1346. Edward later surrendered his claim in return for French territories. Edward III, 1312 to 1377. English ruler and instigator in 1337 of the Hundred Years' War in support of his claim to the French throne. Edward was also responsible for major legal and parliamentary reform at home. His son, also called Edward, was a great soldier known as the Black Prince because of the color of his armor. Edward the Confessor. Henry V, 1387 to 1422. Inheriting the English throne in 1413, Henry redoubled the war against France and defeated the French at Agincourt in 1415. By 1420, he had established himself as the French heir, but he died before he could succeed, and all his conquests were lost in the reign of his son, Henry VI. See also Joan of Arc. Vlad Tepes, circa 1430 to 1476, Romanian baron who murdered thousands of people by impaling them on stakes, earning him the nickname Vlad the Impaler. His unparalleled cruelty provided the basis of the Dracula legend. Rebellion and Reformation. Saint Francis of Assisi. Saint Benedict, circa 480 to circa 550. Founder of the Benedictine religious order and creator of its vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Known as Saint Benedict's Rule, these vows were eventually adopted by holy orders across Europe. Saint Thomas Becket, 1118 to 1170. Henry II's Archbishop of Canterbury and close friend, Becket quarreled with the king about church reform. As a result, 4 of Henry's knights murdered him. He was later canonized. Saint Francis of Assisi, circa 1182 to 1226. A rich man who gave away his fortune, Francis founded the Franciscan order of friars who traveled around preaching, begging for food, and communing with nature and animals. Simon de Montfort, circa 1208 to 1265. Organizer of a group of English barons who challenged King Henry III to reform his government, a council the king could consult at will. Defeating Henry in 1264, de Montfort summoned the first English parliament, which included knights from each shire and citizens from the major cities and towns. Wat Tyler died 1381. Leader of the English peasant revolt of 1381, King Richard II initially agreed to their demands to abolish high rents, serfdom, and the poll tax, but he later recanted. During the fighting, Wat Tyler was killed by the mayor of London. Joan of Arc, 1412 to 1431. Peasant girl who led the French armies against the English forces of Henry VI. She was captured by the enemy and burned at the stake in Rouen, France in 1431. Savonarola, 1452 to 1498. Italian friar, orator, and reformer who led a revolt in Florence, Italy, which expelled the powerful Medici family and then established a republic. He also denounced the corrupt Pope, Alexander VI, who had him tortured and burned for heresy. Joan of Arc from a book illustration. Arts and Sciences. Saint Bede, Venerable Bede, circa 673 to 735. English monk and scholar who wrote, among other important works, the Ecclesiastical History of the English Nation, a primary source for students of English history. He also produced a history of the saints, a study of holy martyrs, and a textbook to help his pupils write poetry in Latin. Avicenna, circa 980 to 1037. Arabian philosopher and physician whose Canon Medicinae, or Canon of Medicine, combined his own knowledge with that of Roman and Arabic physicians to become the standard work for centuries. Giotto, circa 1267 to 1337. Born in Florence, Italy, Giotto di Bondone founded the central tradition of Western painting and had an enormous influence on Renaissance artists such as Masaccio and Michelangelo. Geoffrey Chaucer, circa 1340 to 1400. One of the greatest poets of the Middle Ages, Chaucer is best known for his Canterbury Tales, a collection of stories told by pilgrims on their way to Thomas Becket's shrine in Canterbury. Christine de Pizan, 1364 to 1429. One of the few medieval women to write books and poetry professionally. At this time, few women could even read and write. Christine de Pizan often dealt with feminist issues. Geoffrey Chaucer. Johannes Gutenberg, circa 1398 to 1468. German inventor of printing using movable metal type arranged in words and lines instead of the solid printing blocks for each page that were used previously. Gutenberg printed 2 early versions of the Bible. Jan van Eyck died 1441. Born in the Netherlands, Jan van Eyck is one of the most revered of all early painters. Although much of his youthful history is uncertain, his mastery of color and detail left an unequaled model for his successors throughout the Renaissance and beyond. They also left us with a unique insight into the quality of medieval life. Johannes Gutenberg in blue in his workshop.